各位这个尊敬的后米巴巴先生，各位朋友们，上午好。这个参加今天的这个演讲啊，我既高兴又紧张。高兴是我有一个倾听学习的机会，紧张是我作为一个艺术家的这样一个理论爱好者，来承担这样一场具有众多文化理论期待的演讲，是否能够胜任，我深感压力。刚才张颂仁先生介绍了从西天到中土，是这一届上海双年展整个学术活动当中的非常重要的一部分。它已经延续了2个月，今天是第6场，最后一场。在热腾而喧嚣的今日中国，能够有这样一场旷日持久的文化演讲和对话，我个人觉得是罕见的，也是不容易的。这个西天大家都知道，指的是印度，尤其对于我们中国人，佛教的西土。中土是中原中国人自己想象的中心之地。那么显然这个是关系到中印文化思想交流的一次文化的对话。其实中国和印度的思想交流历史悠久，它已经构成了中国文化的非常重要的一部分。这次研讨是这样一个悠久传统的当代的延续。这一次从西天到中土的系列演讲和对话，得益于上海双年展主办部门的支持，得益于张颂仁、高世敏他们这几位中国当代文化研究的学者慎密的思考和长期的准备，甚至还得益于他们的经济投入。所以我个人觉得这样一个系列的研讨会是很不容易的。从西天到中土本身就道出了主讲人的一个位置，从印度到中国，但也不尽然。今天讲西天，不仅指印度，可能还指更加遥远的西方。在这里头，我们又遭遇了一种身份的问题。我不知道来参加今天研讨会的各位当中，一定有学者，有对赫米巴巴后殖民理论非常了解的人，也有一般的文化青年。我在这里还是要告诫大家，在霍米看来，种族的问题不是身份的地位问题，真正代表人的是他面对人权、平等权等所做出的政治立场和伦理选择。这个呢，我们有过一个10多年前有过一次经验， 1998年，记得也是这个季节，我所在的美术学院曾经和不同肤色的当时2000年 Documenta 的策展团的团队，在中国进行过激烈的论辩。过了几年以后，我们回过头来一看，这里存在着一个很大的误解。这个小组在西方被认为是西方的他者，到中国来，我们把它当作了西方。所以我在这里就可能告诫大家，不能简单的从一个种族身份来揣度他的演讲当中的种种论述和他的意志。霍米巴巴是国际著名的后殖民理论家，现在是哈佛大学的英美文学和语言的讲座教授，也是一位非常有诗人气质的文化批评家。他在他的后殖民与后现代中，曾经深刻地揭示了后殖民批评在于揭露今天世界的3种病理，社会病理。一个就是在今天的霸权斗争当中的不平等的现象，文化的不平等的现象。第二个是现代性意识形态话语在不同国家所设定的一种霸权规范。第三是现代性在现代化过程当中如何压制其自身的矛盾和冲突。霍米的这些分析是很有意义的，他还一再的告诫我们要不断的反思自己的立场和位置，不断地追问自己，反思自己，我是谁。所以他非常强调文化定位，他把他的文化定位既不是定位在后殖民宗主国的文化普遍性的意义上，也不是定位在抹平差异的多元话语之上，而是落在处于中心之外的文化疆界之上。他提倡边缘文化立场对主导地位的殖民文化的改写。他的这些理论和见地是很有魅力的，发人深省的。我认为他的根本的观念是文化差异的观念。他提出关于差异的生产性空间，也就是他所说的第3空间。这个第3空间不是想象中的2种对立的文化，或者杂糅这种2种文化之外的第3者，也不是调停其间的综合的客观性，而是使各种立场都能够得以呈现的那个自由的生产性的空间。在这里边，他尤其提出要警觉权力对于主体性的一种催化的作用。我想他的这些分析都是非常精到，对我们起了深思和借鉴的作用。作为一个去国者，或者称为四海为家者，霍米对全球化的文化给予深切的关怀，对当代艺术他也非常的关注。这一次讲演，他特意认真的写了他的讲演稿，题目叫《野蛮与文明：关于全球化文化的思考》。 下面就让我们以热烈的掌声，请霍米开始他的演讲，并且请他站着讲。
Thank you. I wanted to, I will say it from there, since you asked me to stand up, but that was a really wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. Good morning, and thank you all very much for being here today. It is a great pleasure and a great honor to be here. My second trip to China this year. In June, I was in Beijing for a week at Beida, and now it is extremely exciting and enthralling for me to be in Shanghai. Before I start my talk, I would like to thank Professor Xu Jiang for an incredibly carefully thought out introduction. I'm most grateful to you, Professor Xu Jiang, for your explication of my work. I have to say it often sounds better in Chinese than in English. You're absolutely right. I have been very intolerant of theories that reduce intercultural issues to problems of identity. This, I believe, is truly an Anglo-American issue because of ideas of American individualism and also concepts of individualism in the West. Any interest you have, any practice you engage in, somehow becomes an identity. And unfortunately, this creates a very narrow way of looking at culture, looking at human interaction, looking at aesthetic or ethical involvement and engagement. And I thank you again for emphasizing what is at the center of my lecture today, which is the importance of a shared ethical problem, or a shared ethical project, or a shared ethical aspiration, or an idealism in the global world. And that is what my lecture today is very much about. It's about the ethics of globalization and how we might understand, both philosophically and aesthetically, the situations that we confront today. So I'm very grateful to Professor Xu Jiang for that very well considered introduction. I also want to thank a new friend who seems like a very old friend, not in terms of his age, but in terms of his warmth and his welcoming, Professor Johnson Chang. For a professor of literature like me, I was sitting in the hotel this morning and thinking of which literary figure Dr. Johnson Chang reminded me. And of course, I don't know if you are familiar with the great figure Dr. Johnson. Now, Dr. Johnson, as you know, wrote a great dictionary. Dr. Johnson, in that sense, was a great curator of the English language and of English literature. He wrote the first, in the early 19th century, he wrote the late 18th, early, he spanned it. He wrote the first great book of criticism of British poetry, and he collected these various portraits of poets, and he made what today, I am sure, would be an exhibition, because very few people want to read books today. Everybody wants to go to the museum. So I think Dr. Johnson has been very well named by me today, not by his father. I asked him, did your father call you Johnson after Dr. Johnson? He said no. But today I name you. I don't give you an identity, only a name. I name you Dr. Johnson also for another reason. Dr. Johnson is very well known for his very close companion, who was called Mr. Boswell. And Mr. Boswell always looked after Dr. Johnson with great hospitality. And Johnson looked after me with the same hospitality in Hong Kong. So you are both Dr. Boswell and Dr. Johnson. So I give him two names, but I don't give you two identities. I want to also thank your team for their help. There are people standing just outside the door. I think if anybody wants to come in, please feel, I'm happy to take an extra minute for that. Can you understand, I mean, those of you who do understand English, is this the right speed for me to go? Can you understand it? All right. So if there are moments when I am less comprehensible, please let me know. Now I want to start, as you will see, with a personal experience of mine. And in fact, in this lecture, I move from conceptual and aesthetic issues to personal issues, because I think it is in the mixture of the two, in the articulation of the two, that, in my view, we can both think about the ethical and the aesthetic, the conceptual and the practical. And my lecture today attempts to do that. At the edge of the Tiergarten in Berlin, amidst the tangle of pine forests and wooded parks, the House of World Cultures appears awkwardly out of its element. It is as if a giant mollusk or a giant sea creature, lost in its pursuit of water, had beached itself in the middle of an urban park. Known throughout the city as the Oyster, what was once the US Cultural Center is now the preeminent site in Berlin for international exhibitions, multicultural events, and global intellectual dialogues. Wu Hong, professor of Chinese art history at the University of Chicago, and Shaheen Merali, then chief curator of the House of World Cultures, generously invited me to deliver the inaugural lecture at the opening of their art show, Reimagining Asia, 1,000 Years of Separation. I had prepared myself for the event by studying their manifesto for the show, which contained an intriguing insight into their curatorial intentions. Their goal was to deflatten the presentation and interpretation of international art through developing what they called a new regional approach. Instead of defining Asia in terms of static political geography or cultural and ethnic identity, they wrote, we approach it from an artist's point of view as a place both real and imaginary, and as a collective of diverse cultural and aesthetic traditions. In this sense, the notion of geographical subjectivity not geographical specificity, but geographical subjectivity, can be construed as one of the central ideas of reimagining Asia. And the difference between a geographical specificity and a geographical subjectivity is interesting, because there is a widespread use of a particular kind of discourse in globalizing languages where large overarching principles are enunciated, and then on the other side one is always asked to specify, as if any specific issue were only an illustration or an example of a much larger principle. But that, I think, is a very problematic issue, because the power always rests in the general principle, and the specificity is always only a second order example. So geographical subjectivity, as they tried to develop the concept, was something different. They wanted to give every regional place, every regional art form, every regional aesthetic tradition or philosophical idea its own space to develop and its own mode of representation. What would be the geographical subjectivity of a region amount to in the absence of a static political geography or locally based identities? How would an art practice articulate such a deflattening representation? Now, the word deflattening, so there's a lot of music here today while I speak. The notion of deflattening comes from the art historian and art critic Daniel Buren, who's also a great art practitioner. And his idea was that very often, when you take objects belonging to different cultures and put them in a museum, one object next to the other, the profile of the object gets flat. You do not see the whole object as it stands. Could I please request you to turn your I'm sorry to say this, but it is very distracting, for me certainly, and I assume for the audience too. We are so used to living with our telephones that when people say turn them off, we think they are a mental act. That in our minds we put them off, but we don't actually switch them off. If you wouldn't mind switching it off, it would help me to get through this speech quickly, so then we could have some questions and answers. Like this, I'm going to have to waste a lot of time. How would an art practice create such a deflattening perspective? Is the deflattening of international art a call for more historical and cultural thick description, as Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, once called it? More formal specificity, more contextual and institutional detail. All this and more. But what is the more? The excess that goes beyond carrying the burden of a regional representation. The meanings of artworks involved in the resignification of regionality circulate around a paradoxical and ironic point of view, in which resemblance, the sense of being alike, which we often expect when we talk about a region, that there is something shared, that there is something alike, resemblance encounters in any regional analysis the alterity or otherness of recognition. So there is always a dialectical tension, a conflict in any regional study between that which resembles everything else, between a sense of sameness and a sense of difference. And it is this tension that I'm going to talk about at some length today. Now, this idea that every moment of a certain kind of resemblance is also the moment of a disruption of that resemblance or difference, if you think of it, has had a long history. Karl Marx's notion of alienation, for instance, emerges in a system where on the one hand there is an attempt to create a hegemonic, homogenizing view of the working class, of class relations, and at the same time there is a moment of alienation. You both know yourself and you do not know yourself. In Freud, Sigmund Freud, it's exactly the same. That we resemble each other because we have certain rational, social, and symbolic relations, but the unconscious motivations in each one of us marks out our difference. So I just want to give you some examples of this. We could talk about it at greater length. So this tension between resemblance and the recognition of difference is very close to what Giorgio Agamben, the philosopher, describes as the encounter with the face, the visage, the face of otherness. The face, he writes, is the simultas, the being together of the manifold visages constituting it, in which none of the faces is truer than any of the other faces. To grasp the face's truth means to grasp not only the resemblance, but rather the simultaneity of the visages, the way they all come together, and in coming together they show their differences. That is the restless power, the unsettled restless power that draws them together. So I thought of this notion of the face in Agamben was very close to the problem of identification, identity, and at the same time regional differences. We need to talk about a region together, but we do not want to give that region a monologic homogeneity. We want to be able to see the differences, the different balances, the tensions, the articulations of difference within any concept of the regional. The artworks of what I will call regional alterity or otherness. Is the word alterity in Chinese the same as the kind of otherness, an internal notion of otherness, an internal notion of splitting? So the artworks of regional alterity perform a dialectical tension, conflictual and contradictory, within the concept of the simultaneous. It is not a reflection of the consensual, national or global, but a certain kind of synchrony of the differences somehow coming together. Resonant with Walter Benjamin's concept of translation, the partial and displaced signs and symbols of regionality or geographical subjectivity, and I quote Walter Benjamin, may match one another in the smallest detail, although they need not be alike one another. You can match something and yet it's not the same thing. For each translation, or in our case, each regionalist art object or art production or art practice expresses its own kind of aesthetic and historical intention. To redirect our thinking of or our viewing in this way is to understand regionality, the concept of Asia or South Asia or West Asia or East Asia, for example, as never simply one territory, one homogeneous unified territory, topos or locos, nor indeed simply as the other, extraterritorial, paradoxical, and forever languishing in liminality. How then do my conceptual intuitions about difference and alterity as a cultural practice translate into the art experience itself? Is the experience of alterity representable at all? Is the experience of difference, as it interrupts resemblance or identity, capturable in a particular artwork itself? Because as you know, theorists like me are famous for making interesting statements, but then you have to back them up with some actual examples, and I'm going to try and do that now. So I take you back to the art show I mentioned in Berlin, And as I was walking through it, as I entered the hall of Reimagining Asia, I saw this conceptual insight that I had about regionality translated into a work of art. A work that had a translational regionality in its own itinerary. A work of art that was influenced by Wuhan and Beijing and Zurich, and yet mediated these different locales and representations. The artist, the Chinese artist, Xi Jinping, addresses an alterity that constitutes a history of the human being in common, what I call the similitude or the simultas, that also at the same time demonstrates a restless alterity, a restless, unsettled sense of anxiety and alienation within the artwork itself. Common humanity, my friends, and uncommon barbarity are strange but close bedfellows in Xi Jinping's works. As I entered the museum, at a distance, I saw a collection of finely designed, high-tech, child-friendly nursery objects entitled Babies Miscellaneous, 2007-8. Slides 1, 2, and 3, please. Right. We can go, you can just go from 1, 2, and 3 as I talk. More architecturally accomplished than such everyday objects usually are, these matte black, high-profiled objects, a child's pushchair, a cradle, and a child infant stroller, have just the look that would capture the market in our era of commodification of designer childhood. You know, now one of the largest markets is very expensive clothes for children. All the great designers, Armani, Christian Dior, all of them are making extremely expensive clothes. Mercedes-Benz produces a small, completely functioning Mercedes for children of 10 years old to drive. I mean, this is the madness that I think Xi Jinping is pointing to on the one hand. So, on the one hand, all these toys look like very smart, children's nursery toys produced by Porsche. You almost think that they look like sports cars from a side. They're very, very smart, high design. According to the Wall Street Journal, more than 80% of children's toys sold in the US come from China. So, I'm doing what I called an analysis of regional particularity while looking at the same time at global expectations and global articulations. There is also a more global reference in the second annual American Express Platinum Luxury Series survey of 2005 to the rapidly increasing market for gold-plated nursery must-haves. People must have these, rich people must have these things for their children so that their neighbors can see that they're rich. There is never, we always think that people with great wealth are secure. But people with great wealth can never be secure because they always want to show somebody how rich they are. It is not, if you continually want to demonstrate how rich you are, you can never really be secure. According to a recent article in Salon.com entitled "Ringing Up Baby," and ringing up is, when you use the cash register. which says the people behind the Posh Tots catalog have seen it fit to combine the uniquely incompatible words of child and chandeliers. And now for the nursery of children, they produce crystal chandeliers. All this is at one level visible in the sculptural works themselves, and indeed which are also installation works. The ambivalence of alterity or self-alienation is, however, inscribed by Xi Jinsong in the very construction of these objects themselves. He writes, "Art displays hidden messages and makes them evident. I try to make it easy to see the dark side of an object. That's why I stress the violence and the danger." When you see them from afar, they look, as I said, like these objects that have a kind of perfection to them. They're expensive children's nursery implements. When you come closer, you see that they are themselves constructed from military hardware, guns, shields, and bullets. Each one of these children's nursery implements is an explosive military object, created out of military objects, and therefore is also a military metaphor. What is it a metaphor of? What is the dark side of these objects? The dark side of childhood, which I have described in the West as being part of a new commodification market, regionally and indeed globally has a very different significance. It represents the increasing growth in world politics of child soldiers. Child soldiers are one of the largest growing bodies of military combatants, if you can think about it. Children sent to fight as soldiers. Drugged, often the children are drugged, half demented, controlled by warlords, sent out like packs of animals to wreak a distracted, barely understood fate of doom and destruction. From a distance, the implements of infancy have a kind of surreal modernist irony, a subversive civility that is part of art's, modern art's, witty affect. At closer inspection, there is the barbarity of the juxtaposition of child warfare with the hideous commodification of children's toys and nursery implements on the millionaire and billionaire marketplace. This as an introduction to the kind of problem about civility and barbarism, art and alterity, regionality and difference that I will explore today. Reimagining Asia makes it crucial to understand the important difference between acknowledging Asia or any other region as a site of alterity and celebrating it as a pluralistic site of alternative modernities, which has become a very popular way of thinking about modernity, and one that I'm actually quite critical of. The popular discourse of alternative modernities suggests that there is a self-sustaining normative modality of modernity, Western post-Enlightenment modernity, in relation to which supplementary outposts have emerged in the post-colonial world. These alternative modernities in the post-colonial world, in the developing world, in the non-Western world, provide diverse practices of everyday life and traditions of critical thinking that questions what it means to be modern or contemporary on a global scale. That's the claim of a lot of the theories of alternative modernities. Now, I have somewhat of a critical perspective on this. I ask, is the norm of enlightened modernity ever free of the alterity, the internal contradictions of colonial power? Was modernity, as it emerged in the mid to late 18th century, through the 19th century, ever free of the colonial history, which was also its own history. There is no alternative. The two things develop together. Modernity, civility, nationalism, developed at the same time, was created by the same people who created colonization, who created natives, who hijacked the modern development of other countries and other peoples. So there is no alternative. The two things are bound together like grotesque twins. And we have no choice to accept this or that. We have to accept both things at the same time. The civilization and the barbarism come together. We do not have any possibility of standing back and saying, I will take this, but I will not take that. That is the true contradictory nature of modernization and modernity. That you have to be able to think aporetically. You have to be able to think in and through that contradiction. You can't simply take one part of it and not the other. Is my pace of speaking relatively comfortable for people who do understand English? Everything all right? Okay, good. I'm fine, thank you for the moment. Thank you very much. Was modernity, therefore, ever a freestanding state of mind or society in which the citizen subject was capable of unshackling his existence from that of the colonized subject, or freeing himself from the shadow of the living dead, the ghosts of the colonized, the oppressed, the enslaved, the indentured? If an alternative, as in the phrase alternative modernities, means to offer us a choice between one of two things, that's after all what an alternative is, to offer us a choice between one of two things, then are we ever free to choose between anything other than the paradox between civilization and barbarism that have an intertwined existence? I do not believe we are. I do not think that in our time we can say we are free to choose the one or the other, because both of them constitute the dialectic of the global. And indeed, if we need to work with globalization, we have to be vigilant about this possible intertwined contradiction, which in a way holds us all strangely and restlessly together, as Giorgio Agamben suggested. Barbarism and civility do not resemble each other, but they exist in a condition of being together, a state of simultas or simultaneity. Are we free to choose between the fate of post-imperial Euro-America and the capacities and conditionalities of the post-colonial world? Global history allows us no such voluntaristic choice, because the European era of the modern citizen, the long 19th century, was also the age of the systemic counter-modernity of the slave, the native, the domesticated woman, the oppressed and the marginalized. It was the alterity then, the internal contradiction, the internal alienation of the long 20th century, the internally contradictory and fragmented sense of being together, which is continually threatened by being torn apart, which caused Adorno to say in the late 1950s, I consider the existence of National Socialism within democracy, the problem or the danger of National Socialism within democracy, potentially more threatening than the continued existence of fascist tendencies against democracy. You see the point? What Adorno is saying is even democracy has within it inherently its own fascistic tendencies. Adorno says in 1950, I'm more worried about that than I am about the more obvious oppositions of fascist groups against democracy. And what this shows is the contingency, the delicacy, the terribly subtle and problematic ways in which civility and barbarism can turn one into the other. I mean, of course, the most common example of this is Germany in the late 20s, where in the Weimar Republic you had the most advanced art, avant-garde, politics, you had the most advanced thinkers in law, and yet within a few years the whole edifice of intellectual accomplishment turns into the machine of genocide. It is once again this intertwined sense of barbarism and civility that is visible in our own times at the start of the 21st century, which prompts Giorgio Agamben to say, and I quote, "The refugee must be considered for what it is, namely, nothing less than a limit concept of our own modernity that at once brings a radical crisis to the principles of the national state and clears the way for a renewal of categories that can no longer be delayed." And that is our major responsibility, I believe, in a global time, to think about the renewal of how we can think of the renewal of the nation state, not simply pretending that the sovereignty of the nation state has passed, because it has not passed. The nation state still exercises its sovereignty in many important ways, and there are many important reasons for that it should be that way. There are some people who consider that we are in a new state of empire or in a new state of nomadism, that we all move all around the world. But actually, when people move around the world, refugees, migrants, they settle somewhere, they have to have homes, they have to have schools. These are things that only the nation state provides at the moment. So I think there is a huge exaggeration amongst postmodern globalists who consider that the sovereignty of the nation state has passed and we now live in a continual state of transnational euphoria. Unfortunately, people with the recession recently have also woken up from that dream, and not a moment too soon. It is of the fault lines between barbarism and civility, found in the archive of history and the maze of memory, that I am talking today. What are the redemptive aspects of a global alterity rather than a global simultaneity that holds us together and yet threatens to tear us apart? And as much as we are ethically responsible for holding together, we have to be ethically cautious and vigilant about the forces that can tear us apart at the same time. What power does art possess to perform the spirit of simultas and alteritas, of semblance and difference, and to hold together the human condition, but not without the conflict and negotiation of differences? How do we, as artists, as thinkers, as politicians, as students, think about the duty to translate, to transmit, to enter into the aesthetic and ethical activity, but also to maintain at the same time the locality of material, the regionality of values, the singularity of aesthetic scale, the spontaneity of spectatorship, the passionate immediacy of our affects, our emotions, our imaginative identifications? How does the intercultural and the intersubjective relate to this endless repetition, this flipping over of barbarism and civility, this endless movement between them? As you know, after great political upheavals, moments of great political violence, history says, never again. Never again. This will not happen again. Genocide will not happen again. Murder will not happen again. Political barbarism will not happen again. And at the same time, historical memory says, again and again and again. And I think an ethics of globality is a very difficult thing, as I shall explain, because we are always caught between trying to do everything we can politically, institutionally, legally, to make sure that the great violence of human being against human being, of nation against nation, war, genocide, torture will never happen again. It's right. We have to believe that. But in our time, it is also the great problem that we have at the same time to believe that it can happen again. We are caught on the crossroads between saying never again and having to accept it may well happen again. It's only when we take this double position, with all its complexities, with all its ambivalences, that we can ourselves become ethically vigilant. As much as we believe in progress, we have to believe in the possibilities of regress. If we don't, we lose that anxiety, that necessary anxiety of ethical vigilance. Let me elaborate on this idea by moving again away from theory into a personal experience, rather like looking at Shi Jinsong's work, which will give you a sense of what I mean. It was an unsettled, wet day in May. The rain skidded over the windscreen, blinding us for a moment, and then suddenly clearing away, giving us no hint of what kind of weather we were to expect. My host, a German professor from Munich, suddenly suggests that we make a stop in Nuremberg. You must see Nuremberg. I must take you there. Where? I stuttered, really meaning why. And then, of course, I quickly added, yes, what a good idea, which is, of course, is a completely inappropriate response to go to Hitler's, to the center of the Aryan myth, to Hitler's parade ground of violence. I vaguely remembered a film about the Nuremberg trials, witness for the prosecution, that I had seen as a child in Bombay, much before I knew anything about Albert Speer, the great architect of Nuremberg, or the millions of Nazis who frequently gathered in what Hitler called the city of the rallies. Just these slight recollections, Hitler's high-pitched and heinous voice, and a tired phrase from that great philosopher Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil, trailed along in my mind as we drove off the Autobahn and after some suburban maneuvering arrived at the parade ground, the Zeppelinfeld, Hitler's massive parade ground. Can we please have slides 4, 5, and 6? I'm sure you've seen pictures of the parade ground in many films, and I just want you to see this vast place where people used to be brought, common people were brought by busloads to demonstrate the great support that Hitler had. And of course this became central to the documentary films of that time that gave support to fascism. The vast stadium of soaring stone and empty crumbling terraces now was almost soundless. There are 3 slides, you can just show them as and when you like. Where hundreds of thousands once stood to rapturous roaring attention, today in the rain there were only a few of us. A man scraping the rust off his car, children baiting a dog, a few of us tourists and visitors at a loss for words, and what was far worse, without any sense as to how to behave, where to look, and what truism of history to utter. Nobody wanted to climb to the pinnacle of the Zeppelin Tribune to stand at the podium and assume Hitler's viewpoint, from which he commanded the attention of his followers. Nobody pointed a camera at anything or anybody. Nobody wanted to take a photograph, a family photograph, in this place of shame and ignominy. No family group, no quick shot of the children at play in the Zeppelin field, now overgrown with weeds and grasses, its balconies chipped and bruised, its colonnades long since demolished. This historical site of shame was neither background nor foreground. It was strangely there and nowhere. And it seemed to me, it created in me a tremendous disturbance, because usually when you go to see a monument, there is some sense of awe. There was a sense of awe, but it was a sense of awe and horror and shame. Suddenly I felt nobody knew how to behave there. We were there, but people didn't take photographs. We were there, what were people to do? It was a very strange kind of, as if you were living in an in-between state, in an uncomfortable interstitial state. You didn't know what to do with each other. The thoughts that went through my mind on that day suggested the problems of trying to dispossess a shameful heritage site. How do you dispossess a site or a subject of history and yet preserve and protect the traumatic heritage of its memory? You have to both in some way move beyond it, but you can never and should never move entirely beyond it, because the memory is important to keep alive. Otherwise, you lose your own moral and ethical judgment and its vigilance, on the other side of which lies the death of culture and the destruction of humanity. If, as they say, nature hates a vacuum, history is even more repelled by it. But that repulsion is also a propulsion. You move in and out. You are drawn into the vacuum and you spin out of it, thrown back on yourself. What does it mean to be in close proximity to the half-life of heritage? What happens to you as you face the threshold of barbarism, knowing that civilization is only on the other side of the door and there is an open passage between them? There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism, Walter Benjamin famously wrote. And he continued, and just as such a document is not free of barbarism, barbarism taints the manner in which it was transmitted from one owner to another. As I stood in this place of barbaric transmission, Alexander Kluger's remarkable film, Brutality in Stone, passed before my eyes. These dispossessed moments and monuments, the half-lives of history, are also part of our intangible cultural heritage. Mortar and marble, bricks and stone also have morals, and we must not forget that. They are intangible in a literal sense. It is difficult to touch them or to be touched by such memories, and yet they are very much part of our own tradition, our own heritage, and there is no way that we can pretend that this heritage belonged simply to another phase and another time. If indeed we belong to a global world, we have to, at whatever distance of time or place, also take a responsibility for those things that happened without our own approval. That is in the most difficult part of the moral world of globalization. Nobody is free from it. The value of heritage lies in our negotiating the ambivalent tension between appropriation and alienation. This suggests that as much as heritage may be a cultural possession, a practice, a representation, an expression in UNESCO's description, whose continuity we seek to preserve and protect, we are also possessed by it, as you are possessed by a ghost or a spirit, haunted by shame, anxiety, and humiliation, possessed by the spirit of wars, genocide, social death. I, who had nothing to do with this, who was born in another country after it was all over, still I stood in the Zeppelin-feld that rainy Sunday in a state of profound ambivalence. At first I shrunk away from the sight of dispossession. Noli mi tangere, don't touch me, this is not mine, this is not my history. And then I realized that there was no way out of it. In a global world, that moment of terrible, grotesque trauma was also my history. Only by embracing both possession and dispossession could I construct a discourse of heritage that truly understood the trials and tribulations of the ethical in a global age, not purely epistemological or symbolic obligation that we all have to cultural transmission. Is there another story to be told about the barbaric cultural transmission of history's brutal and global memories? Let me now abbreviate my argument, and I'm indicating this to my translator, who will be following me line by line, but I just want to say that I want to just go beyond and a little quicker so that I can come to my conclusion by suggesting that this idea that in a global world we can never simply choose, as I also argued with alternative modernity, we can never choose this or that because we have to take both the barbarism and the civility together. This was very much a great contribution of the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who, as you know, was the student of Heidegger. Although she very much disagreed with Heidegger's politics, she was profoundly influenced by Heidegger's theory. And one of the things she said, which has stayed profoundly in my mind, is that deadly danger, and I quote from her, deadly danger to any global civilization is no longer likely to come from without. The danger is that a global, universally related civilization produces barbarians from within its own midst by forcing millions of people at different times into conditions which, despite all appearances, are the conditions of barbarism. So once we start thinking about the interconnections, what I called at the start of my paper, the simultas, the resemblance we have in the world, once we want to make those interconnections, we are not then in a position to say we will only take what is good and we reject what is bad. We have to take responsibility for both things. With this in mind, I began to think of the notion of art as a moral or ethical witness. And this, as I come to the end of my lecture now, that is what I'm going to concentrate on. How, if you take responsibility for civility and barbarism and the way in which it works simultaneously, if you refuse the idea of saying you can choose, then how do we become ethical and moral witnesses? The great philosopher Avishai Margalit poses a question that I could not have put better. He says, is the moral witness a forward-looking creature even when his or her testimony is about the past? However much we think about the past, we cannot remain in the past. I have argued we cannot lose the past. We cannot pretend it is not our past. We cannot only put our money and our bets on future progress, we have to live in between these two things. And when I was thinking about this very important question, which is at the center of my book, I'm writing a book at the moment on these issues and only giving you one argument from the book. But when I began to think about this, I thought Margaret had put the question very well. As moral witnesses, of course, our attention is taken by the great sins of the present and the past, but we have to look to the future. What kind of a situation are we in? This is my answer to that question. The moral witness is caught in a double time frame of memory, surviving the testimony of the past while trying to possess the freedoms of the future. This complex temporal layering of memory consists, one might say, of a past that refuses to die, while the future refuses to be born. Ethically, we are caught in between these two time frames. A past that we cannot forget, and a future that is not yet ours to provide us with a platform of judgment. Memory's global reach is not merely a spatial extension of ethical attention that crosses cultures, moves beyond borders, and converges upon new maps of the global world picture. New internationalisms, new financial sectors, new technologies. The ethical project of global memory is a more mixed and mediated reflection upon what I have called the barbaric transmission of cultural values. How do we create our art? How do we create our philosophy? How do we create our politics when we are continuously caught between a barbaric past that will not go away and an aspirational past that is not, and an aspirational future, I beg your pardon, that has not as yet been born? We are continually, I believe, caught between that situation of a time past that returns and a time future that rushes onto us without us having control of it. The principal artists I will discuss this evening as I end, Emily Yassir and Mona Hatoum, are artists who position themselves, I believe, in their very different ways, precisely at that point of a past that will not die and a future that wants to be born prematurely, so that we have to confront a profound ethical and moral dilemma. They are diasporic artists of our times, crossing cultures, making the traces of global memory in their trysts with migration. Their immersion in the history of the present consists of a deep engagement, not only with the global world picture as we know it, but also with the way in which their very materials of manufacture are implicated in the memories of other times and of other histories of alterity. What are the historical terms and aesthetic conditions that govern cultural transmission in a world of global displacement? Emily Yassir, an artist of Palestinian descent living and working in New York City, is committed to the establishment of an independent Palestinian state and to the rights and representations of its citizens. But when an interviewer asks her the question, "Who is your community?" she refuses to give a straight answer. Her work, she insists, is about going back and forth. Back and forth in the way in which I suggest is actually the predicament of us all as we go back and forth between civility and barbarism. She says, "It is about the relationship of myself and my experience and my body to my surroundings. Whether it's here or in New York or in Ramallah in Palestine, it is about passing rough places, about me wandering through space and time, and about borders and crossings and exchanges." Yassir's response refuses the suggested identification of are you Palestinian or are you not Palestinian? The kind of identity question that is continually put to people who have a political commitment. Although committed to a national home for the Palestinians, she chooses not to subscribe to the potent myths of cultural authenticity that so often drive the exclusionary impulse in any nationalist movement. Yassir's account of her work interposes the space and time of the body. It's the body that becomes the mediating factor as a bridge across artificial islands and borders that have been created. The two-video installation, Ramallah, New York, slides 7 and 8, please, juxtaposes scenes of everyday Palestinian life shot in similar locations in Ramallah and New York. So, one of these is a barber in Ramallah, the other one is in New York. You are never told which one is in Palestine and which one is in New York City. In fact, there is no way that you can definitely know. Although every time I say that, somebody says, no, we know this one because they part their hair on the right side in Ramallah and they part it on the wrong side. But it's very difficult to know which is in New York and which is. And that's the whole point of this great artwork. You will not know which is in New York and which is in Ramallah. Now, what is the meaning of this? And that's what I've tried to understand. Yassir's suggestion is not, I believe, that Ramallah and New York are indistinguishable from each other in some great myth of global transnationalism. That's not her point. She's not saying nowadays in a global world it doesn't matter. Every place is like every other place. That's not true. Nor is she drawing our attention to anything as banal as the benevolent truism that ordinary people lead ordinary lives wherever they may be. Yassir's montage of fungible locations and fragile bodies takes a more oblique view of the politics of everyday globalization. Her purpose in making it almost impossible to visually decipher the difference between the locations against the odds that the title suggests is that to acknowledge the specificity of a site while eliding visual recognition. Supposing you take away all the signs of visual recognition, the Palestinian Arabic language or New York street signs, and you juxtapose these two people doing the same thing in different parts of the world, what does that tell us? First of all, I think what we've got to understand is what it does to the viewer. The viewer is split in between vacillating frames trying to respond to the title Ramallah or New York in a state of confusion. Which is which? Which is where? Is this Ramallah or is that New York? If read from the perspective of displacement, the work sets out to relate the two scenarios to each other and to the viewer who stands uncertainly in between the screens through a diasporic narrative of going back and forth. In these seemingly settled scenes of everyday activity, in the complete absorption of both hairdressers with their clients' hair, for instance, there is an unmistakable sense of disorientation and discontent once we realize that whether we are in Ramallah or in New York, we are dealing with the lives of Palestinian exiles and refugees, of people who feel unhomed twice over and are not fully integrated into either homeland. We do not know for certain which of Yassir's scenes takes place in Ramallah and which in New York. But what we do learn from her global montage is that the human measure of time is sustained wherever you are by the body's daily wakefulness, its civic activities, its social relations, played out in specific life worlds. The inveterate scars of war still survive in the blood. The clock of corporeality ticks away with a distinct rhythm and pace, back and forth between civilization and barbarism. Yassir's focus on locality in Ramallah and locality in New York does not neglect more global issues. In fact, in this work, where we do not know which is which, there is a foreboding, an anxiety, that on any moment, on any day, no more than a minute after the video camera has recorded a person's life and its singular sediments, there would be a catastrophe that could forever maim the routine of civil society and the culture of community. In the one place, we do not know which, there lurks the memory of 9/11. In the other, there is the everyday fear of disorder, violence, and violation. We do not know which, but these moments of the traumatic past exist and the traumatic present exist in both places. Which is New York? Which is Ramallah? Our inability to distinguish between locations and name them commits us, in fact, to a larger cosmopolitan ethical vision, to actually go back between each of them, to go back and forth. Through this diasporic movement, we commit ourselves to a double ethical and political duty, to affiliate with the ethic of choosing to become involved with the historic state of both societies. No more this notion of an alternative, that we can somehow be very patriotic in America and not give a damn about the Palestinians, or we can entirely focus on the Palestinians' condition and not care about 9/11. Because in a way, the connection between the two, whatever you think of the role of the United States or whatever you think of the role of Palestine, the connection is what we have to deal with. The connection is what the condition of our lives are about. And there is no question now of sentimentality or patriotism. It doesn't help you. It takes you nowhere. That's the complexity and the difficulty of the notion of a global ethics of barbarism and civility that I've been trying to talk to you today. And as I end, I want to take you to another great artist and another great artwork, where again the artwork itself, like this one or the one by Shi Jin Song, articulates the problem. Art articulating the problem itself. What does it mean to reshape a national symbol even before the nation has been achieved? How does an artwork transform the very terms of freedom when the future of a people is an open question? Mona Hatoum's iconic work, Kafia, which I'm sure you all know, slides 9 and 10 please, intervenes in the symbolic representation of the Palestinian struggle by resorting to the ancient art of embroidery in order to democratize the notion of emancipation. Here, the material chosen is actually the cloth, which is also the sign or the symbol of Palestinian emancipation and the struggle. The kafia, the scarf. The kafia, the cotton headscarf worn by Middle Eastern men, has developed a macho aura in the Palestinian culture of political resistance. Hatoum embroiders its pattern with women's hair, leaving some of the long women's hair, the tresses, uncut, flowing off the square frame of the cloth in a way that breaks the symmetry of the symbol and contests the fiber of male resistance. Also, of course, what she is doing is relating to the notion of the grid, which is so central to contemporary art and the whole notion of minimalism. The concept of the grid, which is so much a part of the early minimalist abstract tradition. Feminizing the kafia, Hatoum writes, brings out a number of contradictions. Can you, for instance, she says, imagine a man in the Palestinian struggle wearing this kafia with trailing female hair? It also, she writes, brings the female voice into the process. One could suggest that the living female hair woven into this garment so widely worn in regions where many women veil their heads outdoors, extends the public domain to include the rights of women, and thus introduces the representation of difference in the very midst of resemblance, rather than suggesting a homogenizing notion of universal equality. It actually says even when we are in the struggle for all people, the struggle of freedom, the struggle of equality, there will be differences within them, differences of gender or generation, or the peasantry versus the urban classes. These have to modulate our notions of universality. What intrigues me, however, as I come to an end, is another part of the introduction of female hair into the male symbol of resistance, of political resistance, the kafir, functioning at once as both a found object and a deliberately placed sign. This fragment of the woman's body turns the kafir into an erotic, fetishized object that embodies both political and psychic power. The hair does not merely feminize the macho symbol, operating as a secondary form of figurative layering. What the hair does, what the women's hair in the male symbol does, is something much more important. It suggests that in any struggle, there is always the outside enemy, the colonizer, the Israel, the oppressor. But those who are committed to fighting the outside enemy often oppress people within their own communities, as indeed women. I think this is the double address of this work of art. And that's my interpretation of it, that there's always the internal marginalized figure who gets even more marginalized in the struggle for emancipation. The barbaric transmission of culture and history, I have argued this morning throughout this lecture, provides an agonizing and ambivalent form of art and politics. The complexity of our situation gives us no easy alternative, no easy exit. The place of a possible global aesthetics and ethics lies somewhere in between memory and the future. It dwells in that transitional moment, the to and fro between a past that I've argued whose ghosts refuse to die, and a future whose gods refuse to await the moment of their destined birth. The language of the now and the new that we use so often in our global vanity is less convincing than ever before. It is therefore in the human interest that we take a double stand in between barbarism and civility and accept the responsibility of both, in between emancipation and equality and accept the tensions of both. It is therefore in the human interest that we take this double stand. If we step into the stream of time to feel the fast flow of progress and its cleansing power, we have no alternative but to wade knee-deep in the sewers of history, feeling the toe of the past, the tug of the dark and the deep. And in this tension in which we live, through which we move hither and thither, sometimes with commitment and sometimes with confusion, there will emerge a current that sustains us, and a currency of creativity that may not save us, but will at least help us together to survive. Thank you very much.